Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we have Phil Borlin to talk with us. But first, let's get Phil started on an introduction, and then we can talk a little bit about growing capabilities in the engineering department and fixing batch size and WIP, and learning culture and the Gemba Walk. But Phil, tell us who you are.
This is Phil Borlin. I'm a senior director of engineering, and that's kind of like my standpoint. I like to build teams, like to introduce mobbing into organizations, and hopefully just bring solid leadership in. And always here to learn how to be a better leader and how I can kind of help and mentor other people.
Awesome. Well, we can jump right into it. So let's talk about growing capabilities and what you were thinking there.
Yeah, so I think that at different points of your career, you always have like different mental models. So, you're going to get today's mental models. And so right now, I've been thinking a lot about like organizational capabilities, right? So maybe you hire a new developer in and they have a skill and that's great, but I'm not interested in, developers having skills, right? I'm interested in organizations having skills, right? So it's this ability to kind of take um bring somebody in who has some knowledge, and then how do we spread that apart, right? And so that kind of leads to why I like mobbing so much is it's a great way to do that.
Nice, nice. Yeah. So, yeah, I think one person having, like you said, a skill, I'm guessing a critical skill,
Yeah.
um, I guess is a risk factor for the organization as a whole, right? Yeah, that I've definitely seen it before. I've been at places where the single code ownership of sections of the code was real, and literally no one else could understand nor touch that part of the code. And there are even threats given if someone else decided to touch that. And so, while it does keep, if that person is able to stay, I guess it keeps your maybe efficiency in some ways higher. But yeah, the risk for the organization is one layer, right? One person.
Well, here's the thing. I think that like yeah, at any given time, you don't always have control, right? You would like to think that as a leader that you can kind of go in there and provide a good environment that will make developers want to stay and have a good time while being productive at work. But we all know that that's not the way the real world works, right? You have a CEO who's, whatever, you have a board that's pushing, you might have shareholders if you're public. So there's a lot of these factors on there that you don't always have control over. And so this idea that that I can just be a better leader and keep my developers, I think is not that's not the real world. Yeah, economic
Yeah,
factors, layoffs, all kinds of stuff.
I totally agree. I think that what I've seen is people leaving a really great environment for a terrible environment uh, for, a pay increase and saying like, I owe it to my family to move, right? So there's certainly that story. And then there's kind of the opposite of people that are burnt out in environments that um, maybe the soul-sucking, high-paying environment, and coming back into something. So there is that the opposite of that factor, but also there's like this idea of career growth and sometimes just learning different styles of things and then evolving in that way. And so it's I think leaders owe it to those that they lead to make it so that mobility is both cost effective for them and the company. And whether or not they decide to stay somewhere, the risks should be relatively low for both parties. But I think we see these environments where they're high risk for both sides.
Yeah. Yeah, so absolutely. So I mean, to me, mobbing is a great way, but it's just there's more to it, and it's there's some kind of like deliberate stuff. So like when you kind of talk about like Kaizen, right? Like So I've been practicing lean for 20 years, and I think if you meet other people who've been practicing for 20 years, they'll all tell you, well, this was a good start, right? Because, maybe at 5 years you're like, oh, I'm getting this, and at 20 years you're like, I know nothing.
Yeah.
Um, and but but if we look at Kaizen and like how to do it properly, right? It's about you need to have a you need to know where you're going, right? And then it's about making incremental steps towards a direction, right? So I think that that's a lot of ways too, is that like you don't well, you might, wake up one day and find that you have a capability because there was a self-organization. I think that's kind of a risky way to look at things. And to me, one of the things is for, somebody in a leadership position is to go, okay, like let's look ahead, let's see around the corner, let's see what types of things we need, what kind of capabilities we need. And then now that you can, kind of lay out something and then the self-organization can happen to kind of go in that direction.
Gotcha. Nice. Nice. Yeah. And a botched quote from the Good to Great book is get the right people on the bus.
Yeah.
And I think maybe a misapplication of that would be to make that like a singular, get the right person on the bus, and that person can never leave, right?
Yeah.
And so that would be, so it's kind of more like people in the plural. And I think you're right. You want an environment where their skills and knowledge can spread with each other. And, and I think it has other benefits too, other than just uh, the person leaves the company and we're all in terrible trouble now. In that I've seen it with mobbing. I know it's on Chris's virtual wall now, not literally the wall was like you can take a vacation at any time, right? So it's like the stress of I'm the only one who can do this means I can't leave very long or else the company comes to a halt is
Oh,
is very, very scary. And also I think in that book he talked about companies that didn't last very long, like they had a spike and then fell away. Was that same pattern where it was all one person? What did he call it? The genius that had 1,000 followers that just did whatever he said. That was not sustainable more than a couple years.
Right.
yeah,
um,
makes sense.
yeah,
I'm glad you brought up vacation because first of all, I love going on vacation. And I want to relax. But I also think that, there's a good reason from a company standpoint. The company can get a lot out of vacation, right?
Mhm.
Because if you look at, if you're in, because especially in programming, right? You're in like these minute details all the time, right? And I know like in the mobbing community, like we always talk about like, hey, we need a retrospect, right? Which is like kind of lifting your head above the water for a second and then so that you can improve the work. But I think that there's even another level, right? There's the like this kind of like clear your mind and don't even think about it. And to me, I think a lot of times that's where a lot of inspiration comes from. And so to me, I really want the developers to go take vacation and then stop thinking about everything and then come back with these like genius ideas that just
Yeah.
couldn't even like your brain just isn't capable of creating that level of insight while you're still processing, the things that you're doing. So getting out of that. So not only is it just about like, well-being for the person, which is fantastic, it's also, I think that, any company that's not setting up an environment like this is losing out on a portion of the genius of their employees.
Totally agree. Yeah, kind of, and I think it's just a signal of organizational health. So if you know, if you have anybody that you have to deny a vacation request for, like that's an anti-pattern in my opinion. Just because it means that you don't have enough redundancy in place to handle their absence. Um, and some people would say like, oh, well, that's really expensive, but with mobbing, the um, I don't think you lose speed by combining work streams. And even if the work streams speed were the same and didn't improve, you'd still have the redundancy. Um, and so I think generally speaking, if you see that, there's probably, just like you do a disaster recovery fire drill, like let's pretend the database went down and let's restore it. A lot of companies had made the mistake of taking backups but never testing them, and sometimes you'd hear stories of you go to restore it and the backup never worked properly, or it was said it was successful but never happened. And so without a fire drill, you really can't do that. And so I think it's the same for people, where if you've never gone without a person on that team, um, or swapping people out, uh, then you don't know really whether or not there is like subtle tribal knowledge being seeded by that person throughout the team. And that was kind of one of the reasons that we had implemented no one works on a single product for more than 2 years at a time, but in moving people between products, you will get these natural flow of questions until it tapers out and then no longer happens. And now you build additional redundancy.
Yeah. 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 I would say, yeah, that's when I'm talking about a capability, that's exactly the reason to build these capabilities. It's just exactly what you described.
Yeah, and I guess one follow-up question I have is, let's say I'm another director, someone like in your shoes, and I hear this elevator pitch that I want to reduce risk by growing capabilities in my department. Um, Practically, how do you do it? How would you guide someone else doing it in kind of the director seat?
Yeah. Yeah. No problem. So, one of the things, right, this is all contextual based on the company size. So, I'm at about 40 engineers, right? If you look at CTO levels, that's a level 5 company. And so the advice I'm going to give is kind of tailored around that type of a thing. But what we really work on is we have in titles don't matter, right? Especially smaller companies, titles are always inflated. So if this doesn't match, what you think of as what this company does, you can just put a different title on it, because I think that's the least important thing in this conversation. But we have a couple principal engineers, and then we have, a number of staff engineers. And what we kind of look at the principal engineers to do is to go out there and start like looking at, where are our weak spots, like where are the risks, like where do we need capabilities at, and to really start to kind of spearhead that. And then we'd move down and say like, okay, great. Now that the principal engineers kind of put forth all this work, they need to start training the staff engineers. And the staff engineers are really there to to make sure these capabilities stick, right? So principal engineers bringing them in, staff engineers making them stick, and then the staff engineers are then training tech leads and all the engineers on that. And what you don't want is to have them be an enforcement layer so much as like to kind of, their job is to bring it into the culture, right? So that like it reinforces itself. Because if you're at a point where like anybody needs to go like, hey, we need to enforce these standards, they don't feel like a capability to me, right? They feel like that's something that you want to be a capability. So by the time like, kind of gets in a definition of done. But I say a definition of done on a capability is that like you're never going to hit everybody, but maybe like 80% is like bought on, is ready to go, and are, using peer pressure or whatever other mechanism push it right, instead of like bureaucratic pressures.
Refactoring is cool, everyone.
Yeah,
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 it's hip.
exactly.
Yeah. Oh, it's lit. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
That's still being
yeah. Gotta get
So,
that Gen Z vocabulary in there.
oh my,
Yeah, and I think that's something I struggle with, but have grown to accept. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on this. The analogy I've used before in conversations I've had with Chris is it's kind of like the slow progress of Frodo taking the ring and destroying it. In
yeah,
that if you don't walk around like a cop and force people to do stuff, that means they really have to buy in.
yeah.
And that means they really have to learn. And that means it's going to take time and it's going to be slow. And that means I'm not hard selling anybody. I'm sharing good things as I would with a friend. And so it tends to take a long time. And I'm okay with that. But I feel like most people are dissatisfied with that trajectory.
So, so that's, I'm glad you brought that up, right? Because it's not that there's never an enforcement time,
Okay.
right? Like like I'm totally okay with this period where you're like, okay, great, we're going to do this. We're going to enforce that people are going to do this. But we have to get to this point. We're like, it's not done when we're in the enforcement period. Right. And this is no different than like, spinning up a new team and saying like, hey, we mob at this company. This is what you have to do. I mean, it's just part of our culture. And there's this enforcement period where you might have to go in there and make sure that, that they really are mobbing. And, it's not where you want to be, but sometimes, in fact, Woody said something at that conference, Chris. What was the conference we went to?
Yeah. I'm not sure
Anyways, we
exactly
don't
what
have
you're
to
referring
say.
to, but yeah.
But anyways, the idea was that like somebody said something about hey, you can launch these types of things as an experiment, and Woody was like, whoa, 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 this is a skill, right?
Yeah.
This might
Yeah,
take
not
10,000
short.
hours,
Yeah.
right? And so we kind of go into this and we're like, okay, great. There's this idea, and I love the idea of proposing experiments, but sometimes when the experiment's over, there might need to be another nudge, right? And when I'm talking about like enforcement, I'm not talking about like, hey, really heavy-handed stuff, but there's this period that that there's this, that you might need more nudges than what you're comfortable with, in a definition of done.
I think I had a coworker give me that feedback is that my personal stance right now is I want to apply zero pressure. Like I want zero of the awkward pressure exuding from me to other team members. And he was like, it's okay to like, you know, give some people some not necessarily hard feedback, but just kind of like, hey man, we're not doing it, or whatever. Or like kind of that like checkpoint or traffic cop kind of thing. I don't know. I struggle with that personally, being the one to give the nudges because I'm that, and I'm not saying this as my recommendation to you or the audience. It's just it's kind of like if you really believe it and you're really bought in, it doesn't require nudges. Like while it does happen less often, when I do see someone who the light switches,
Yeah.
you just kind of get out of their way. They're growing, they're sharing with others, they're making it happen with whatever team they're on. No nudging required.
Well, that's a good point, right? Like that's the
Yeah.
dream scenario, right? Is that you introduce a topic, somebody takes and runs with it, and somehow they have this magnetic personality that drags everybody with them, right? And
Yes.
there definitely ends up those types of situations. I would definitely love that, that all capabilities came into the company through a system like that. Um, I don't, I haven't worked at companies that had, maybe more than one of those type of people, right?
Mm.
And so there's like a scaling factor, but also, um, yeah, and I think I've kind of gone back and forth throughout my career, right? Like there's times where you're like, okay, great, like I'm going to teach from the back of the classroom. No, I like this needs to happen. We're going to teach from the front of the classroom. How do we kind of like balance that? And I don't think there's good answers from it, and I don't meet a lot of people that are good at both, at both ways. And I'm certainly not as good at teaching from the back of the classroom as some colleagues that I have that are really good at that.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is leveraging the relationships that you have around, because I think there is organic growth and then there's also, and there's like bottom up versus, grassroots versus like top down. Um, and Woody does like to say, create the environment where great software is inevitable, just like the quote, great art being inevitable. And so, it's not about making the great software, it's about creating the environment. And so I think as long as there's an opportunity for organic growth to happen, but also this ability that top-down influence can be brought in and accepted, I guess, is really important. And so, I'm very much of the philosophy of I focus heavily on bright spots and I've always had this kind of like philosophy, like flowing like water, like, focus on the areas where you're like having a lot of successes and like doubling or tripling down on that. Um, and often if there is like a problem area, I have to remind myself that it's sucking up too much of my time to focus on that thing, and we can make more progress um by amplifying the good, or and Woody will always say turn up the good in general. And so I do find that, but I also do spend time with, I would say, like my biggest detractors. So like anybody that's like saying, "Oh, well, this won't work," or other things like that. It's like, but more from a perspective of like, "Hey, let me understand your position. Let me show you the thoughts and ideas that I have, and give me your unrestricted feedback. I'm willing to hear it, and I'm not going to take offense. Let's talk through that." Usually, that process ends up building a really strong relationship, which allows for, but a lot of that is like influence, and and then I often tell people, find out what the other person reads or listens to, and find supporting material from that source and things like that to help with that. So I think it's a multifaceted thing. And I do think it's okay to say, like, my opinion is that we shouldn't do this because this is, an expected outcome that I have. But also being flexible in the sense of like, we can go ahead and try it, but like, we should evaluate at the end about whether it was successful, that sort of thing too. So
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe I'm in the middle.
Maybe it's good to like talk about some capability, just some more concrete
Yeah.
things. So
Sure.
for instance, we have like right, because so obviously, right, there's mobbing and like, those types of practices. And so there's, but then sometimes there's like tooling. Like for instance, um, we have um, we have a search provider, and just as we're scaling, it's like their pricing isn't, it's just going out of control. Like we just can't use them. Like somebody
Right.
has to sit down and say like, hey, we have a budget. We have to provide these features. These features require, some kind of a searching tool, and we need to kind of come to that. And so we're in the process of kind of switching vendors there. Um, and it's like, that's when I'm talking about like nudging, I'm thinking like a lot of times it's like, okay, great. Like we just like there's some like resourcing issues. We have this pile of money. We can grow all these we can open up this like capability for all these features by switching search vendors.
Right.
And not everybody's going to be happy with that, right? Because I trust that whoever made the original decision did it for good reasons, and there were good reasons. And I don't like to go and second guess old decisions, because all like
Right.
everything, you know, everything that went into that decision, like all the context is different now. And so to say like, but anyways, but for some reason you have to do that, and there's got to be a change. And I'd love to take the time to kind of get do a lot of consensus building and kind of do that. But every once in a while, like you're like, okay, this has got to happen. We got to do some nudging. And
Yeah.
maybe if I came back in a year, like I would have learned a better way to do that. But all I have is my
Yeah.
current
I
mental
mean,
model.
the philosophy of like what got us here won't get us there is really important, right? And kind of the retrospective prime directive. Everybody did the best that they could with the tools and information that they had at the time.
Yeah.
So I totally agree with all of that. And I've seen both like top-down decisions to move away from vendors, as well as bottom-up grassroots moves as well. We had somebody that was just kind of in learning session time experimenting with other systems, and found that they could save a significant amount of money by moving off of a certain provider. And that was just like a purely organic thing, just through the learning time for individuals that we'd have through the system. And so, uh, and like that's part of, I think, what it means to be in an environment like that, where you have, I think a lot of success in business comes from chance serendipity, right? Like a bunch of things meet up and they just happen to be in the right place at the right time. I think mobbing as a practice was kind of defined in that way. It was just like the right people were there at the right time, and had the right problem in front of them, and then started talking about it. And so uh, so there is like this, I think a lot about how to maximize chance, the opportunity for chance serendipity. Um, And so that means recombining people who normally work together on a regular basis to maybe find a really great event. Or, um, when we went remote, there was a lot of talk about how do you recreate the water cooler conversation. And so we started doing a lot of kind of remote lean coffees that were restricted to a personal item and a work-related item. And you prepare two cards ahead of time and then introduce topics and do a lean coffee. And just we had these little sparks of serendipity that came out. So I do think it's possible to do it that way as well. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing before we move topics, and let you say your last piece on this topic was, I think I might have misunderstood nudge. So if nudge is just being realistic about the actual constraints and facts of the situation, I'm totally comfortable doing that, as opposed to a personal, maybe, in the negative sense, a personal attack or personal critique or be a better person kind of nudge. Like, I'm totally okay being like, hey, if we go this way, I see danger and there's some real constraints and problems here. And so, yeah. Anyways, any final thoughts on growing capabilities before maybe we switch to batch size and whip?
Yeah, no, let's move. Yeah, let's go.
Okay, great. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, what you thinking here with this topic? What's getting you excited?
So, I've just noticed over my career that like a lot of times, this is like the killer skill, right? Being able to like, you know, get your batch size down and get your whip down, right? Like to me, like those are like if I were to say like what are the power metrics for like an engineer or like what are if, okay, now I like understand my language, like what's the next step in my career? And it really goes down to like we're not there to write code, right? Engineers aren't there to write code. We're there to solve business problems and to get outcomes and results for the business. And so this whole like almost so first of all, kind of my history is I like to go to companies that are on fire, that are having kind of delivery problems. Because as soon as we kind of get into delivery cadence, I'm like, I'm bored. I'm gonna go, you know, find another place that's a little bit more on fire. And I don't know, maybe that's psychological problems, but whatever. Um, the uh, the Yeah, and so like a lot of times what I see is when you kind of come in there and you're like, okay, great. We have you have all the kind of classic, and I call it like reading the book you've read, a million times, right? It's like you have all the classic problems. Like we don't deploy very often. We have a lot of our deploys fail. Like the number of deploys, a ratio of deploys to incidents are high. Um, and then yeah, we just maybe we've got to a point where we deploy all the time, but we never seem to get anything done, right? Like we never seem to move the needle for the business, right? And I think that's kind of what entropy brings most companies to. Like if you're not hyper vigilant about this, like I've seen well-performing teams over time kind of get into the situation because it's almost like that's the way the universe wants to run, unless somebody kind of like put something in motion to kind of stop that.
Mm.
And so yeah, so to me, like batch size is all about like kind of uh, bringing down your tickets, making them smaller, even within your tickets, kind of going into smaller and smaller things. And I love that that old code retreat thing where you have maybe 2 minutes, maybe you have 3 minutes, and you gotta write your test. You gotta put your thing in, and then you have to put your git commit message. And if you mess it up and you go over the timer, right? To me, like that's 2 minutes is a little unrealistic in a complex coding system. But the principle is that like we can always do better at that, right? And I think there's another elephant carpaccio. It's a an exercise. It's another good thing about this. But I found that as you kind of like bring down the ticket size, bring down the unit of work, that opens up tons of things, right? One, it's um, it gives you room to experiment. because now all of a sudden, you have something to experiment about, right? Whereas as your batch size kind of grows up there, I find that
Yeah.
this a lot of times what happens is you as an engineer, you feel more pressure because now you haven't showed anybody anything in maybe a couple days.
Right.
And like, oh, when, then the questions start coming. When is this going to get done, right? When is, when, what's your like, hey, let's have a meeting so that you can give me your status, right? And then you're like, okay, now we're making the problem worse. And so to me, like these are like magical things, right? Even at the team level, just bring down the amount of things you're working on, lower those batch sizes, and
What are
then
your strategies for getting teams to see that? Like one problem that I think I've seen in the past is uh, I think teams that have large batch sizes have a really hard time imagining what a small batch is. So any thoughts or advice there?
yeah, to me, so so first of all, like if a team is meeting together every day, and I think at this point, most companies I go to, like there's some sort of a stand up or a daily or there's some
Hmm.
sort of thing, right? Whether it's run well or not is a totally different story. But generally this thing exists. We're
The
not
2 hour stand up.
or whatever. We're not 10 years ago when these meetings didn't exist.
Right.
Um, and to me, it's just and maybe this is kind of getting into the Gemba walk a little bit, but this idea that you know as a leader, you should be visiting these things, and depending on how many teams you have, obviously, I don't have time to be in every single team's stand up every day, but that's not what you need, right? You just need to kind of see what's going on, and you'll see the cards or you'll see the tickets or whatever system you're using in the company. You either see like nobody's using them, and so now they don't have a way to discuss the work, and you don't need a card or a ticket to discuss the work, but generally, I find like if you're bad at this type of stuff, these types of things are 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 points of if you use them as points of conversation, they can be very useful.
Hmm.
Um, and then it's just at that point, like to me, it's like a lot of Socratic, right? Just start asking questions like, okay, what's involved here and what's involved there. And when you kind of get these vague things like, well, I'm going to do this, and then you're like, okay, what are you going to do next? Because you can see that the answer doesn't fulfill what the ticket said. I think that that's kind of an effective tool for getting people to start realizing that, oh, there's multiple steps. Each step might be able to be a card. And then, especially at the director level, right? Like you need to be training your managers, tech leads, they like that's their responsibility. But a lot of times you'll kind of come into an organization where, um, people don't understand their responsibilities and that could be a number of things. And, um, right. And so to me, like, but that's kind of the start, right? And then also then on the whip standpoint, it's just like that's usually painfully obvious, right? There's a team of four with 15 tickets, out there, right? And so, I've been very successful at delivering a lot of things that have like because a lot of like for instance, we had a database initiative. We were switching databases, and it wasn't really it was from the open source model to the cloud version. So it wasn't like a major lift. You were just, two flavors of the same database. And really all that needed to be done was just the team just needed to be given permission to kind of drop some of these other things that didn't really matter. And I find that a lot of times people just, yeah, well, first of all, as humans, right, we develop stories in our head and we don't always check our stories. And
Hmm.
so I'll see a lot of times, engineers will be like, well, I can't do this because the product manager says I can't. And then the product manager will be like, no, I'm getting pressure from the sales team, right? And then you go get the three people in the room, and all those stories are completely false. And I find that that's pretty common. And so, a lot of times these whip problems come up from, these misunderstandings of of pressures that may not even exist in reality.
Yeah, and that it reminds me, it's kind of funny. Me and my wife were actually talking about this in regards to uh organizations outside of work, whether it's running musical theater production or sports kid sports league or that kind of stuff. But the ability to do first things first and do nothing else is so critical. Like, because I think when you're like, okay, you know, I recently heard a story of a CEO who would literally say, I can't pick what's first. You need to do all 50, and would just say that to everything, right? And so, but even if you can say that explicitly or implicitly. So, like, I think I've had this said to me before early in my career. Yes, this card and this card are number one priority, but there's also these 20 other cards, and these are good stretch goals and things for you to do as well. And so, what did I do as a young engineer? I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to spend 2 hours a day on these first two cards, and I'm going to spend 15 minutes on each of these 20 other cards. And so I'm like moving everything 0.5% every day, or kind of thing. And it leads to a lot of stress, leads to a lot of waste, all the things you're kind of talking about. And so that really hit me when you said, give the team permission to let stuff go. That's not number one. I think they feel the weight of the world that they have to do it all, or else they're failing as an employee, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like to me, like if you're talking about like a manager's job of unblocking the team, right? I mean, that's the number one thing is just kind
Hmm.
of you know, sitting down and listening to what kind of stories they believe in their head
Hmm.
and maybe go doing some due diligence to figure out like what, whether any of those are true. Because sometimes they're true, right? Sometimes there is very real pressure.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
like you said, the CEO's like, hey, you got to do these 50 tickets. Like that's real pressure. Other times the CEO says, hey, there's there's this work to do, and here's the quarterly priority. And then you go, oh, wait a second, we got to do all these things, and it's not real, right? And that's like you have to know whether it's real or not. Because if it's not real, absolutely. I mean, as a manager, you can just say, stop thinking about that because there's no repercussions because it wasn't real. And
Mm.
if it is real, then you can go out there and negotiate on behalf of your team and take some of the things that are real and make them disappear temporarily or permanently.
I like it.
Uh,
Yeah, it might be a good time to talk about learning culture and Gemba Walk, just because we're running a little short on time. But yeah.
Well, that's good. If time wasn't running short, then this would be a bad conversation, right? Yeah.
All
No,
right,
but
you have 2 minutes to talk, and then we're going to
Right.
cut you off, and that's
Oh man.
your whip limit. No, I'm just kidding.
yeah, no, good, good. The learning culture. Yeah. So to me, so when I think about like what's the most powerful thing I can do as a manager, right? And it's the Gemba walk, and it's the idea that you go where work is being done. And so that's one of my favorite things about mobbing, right? Like, I can give you an example that a lot of times you have like this idea, right? When everybody's working on their own task, right? You have this idea about like, okay, I think this person's a good engineer. This person's maybe needs a little help in this area. And you're kind of flying blind, right? And I have a phrase that I like, right? That inspiration works better with information rather than perspiration. And so this idea, right, that I can have a mob set up, and I just experienced this the other day, and I was like, oh yeah, like absolutely. Now this engineer that I thought was a good engineer, like they're actually better than I thought they were because now that I'm watching their thought process and I'm watching this type of a thing, I'm like, okay, great. Like those are all like that's good problem solving, right? And like that's why I'm seeing good outputs out of this. And then and then yeah, and then the engineer that maybe is struggling a little bit, like in a one-on-one, like I can get very direct, useful feedback because I could see I could see the thing happening that tripped them up, right? And I could watch that in real time. And I don't have a lot of time to spend time in mobs, but it doesn't take very much time, right? Like an
Mm.
hour or two a week can really unlock like insights. And then we talked earlier about like the stand-ups, right? Just showing up to a stand-up every once in a while and and watching that. Because if I look at a board and I don't have the engineers right there, then like I lose all kinds of context, right? I can't just look at a board and be like, okay, this is what's happening, right? I can get that like little tiny picture, but once I go to the stand up, it like things become painfully or maybe like happily, kind of reveal themselves in a major way. Um, and yeah. And so then so to me, you're like, okay, great. Like, so if I want this learning culture, like I need to know what's going on, like really kind of going on the ground, boots on the ground, right? So that, we can, I can work with other managers and be like, okay, like let's look at the training calendar, which hopefully hopefully you have a training calendar. Hopefully there's like this kind of goes back to Kaizen, right? Like you need to know where you're going and then make those incremental steps, right? So if I know, okay, great, like we've kind of come together, we've talked to each other and said, hey, these are some deficiencies I've seen. Maybe this is a capability we're trying to work on right now. And here's what's happening. Here's who's really getting it. Here's who's not getting it. Here's the stumbling blocks. Um, I don't even know anymore, right? Again, mental model changes over the years, but like I've gotten myself to a point where I don't even know how to develop a learning culture without a Gemba walk anymore. Like
Mm.
it feels like I was flying so blind before I kind of learned this principle.
Yeah, and I thought, maybe I'll have to rethink my career, but I thought the goal, for moving up the ladder was that I sit in one spot and I send out all these middle managers, they go gather up all the status, they bring it back to me, I make all these decisions from my chair. Why doesn't that work?
Um, yeah,
Really,
I mean,
really much
yeah,
so.
I just think it's the fidelity of the information.
Right.
Is that like so at some point, right, you have to understand that, right? And like if you're at a larger thing, right, you might not be able to go down to the engineering, right? You might have too many layers to go down and watch engineers, but you might be able to go watch some principal engineers interact with some engineers. Like, wherever you're at, no matter where you are, I think the Gemba walk's more about going down several levels and really experience what's going on instead of, kind of guessing. And yeah, and then it just like it takes a certain amount of fidelity to really understand what's going on. It's like as an engineer, right? You kind of got to this point where you're like, okay, great, I read the docs on this tool, but if I haven't done a POC, like if I haven't played with it, like
Yeah.
the docs are it's only going to get me so far. Like I need to go touch something. And to me, like this is the manager the analogous kind of point for an engineering manager is like if I don't go down there and experience the engineers working and watching their thought process, like I'm kind of stuck. Like I'm just not going to be able to further my understanding.
Yeah, the what you're saying reminds me, and it's probably coming from a similar lean thought, but I'll post in the show notes. But it was a continuous delivery chat about architecture, um, and what he was saying was that he was dispelling a lot of myths about architecture, kind of the ones you're talking about with leadership, where it's just someone who sits in an ivory tower. But he was saying even if you do need to sit at the high level a lot, and he had the analogy of a building, or maybe it was like a submarine or something, but like even if you need to be thinking at a high level, you also need to take the elevator down to the engine room at least every once in a while. There's so much you're not knowing by not being there some of the time, right? And so, um, yeah, even if you fully trust your perfect league of middle managers reporting status, it doesn't hurt to check it, right? And to get information from the field. And like
This
you're
is
like from what
for
you're
better
saying, I
management.
think that becomes the primary, I would suspect, as opposed to the hearsay from the telephone game. I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
it's interesting. I mean, the Toyota Way was definitely a very influential book for me, and they
Sure.
talk about like actually having managers spend half their day on the Gemba walk, and I've never found a way to do that. Like I haven't,
Mm.
to me, like that's the XP level practice. Probably works very, very well. I haven't figured out how to do it yet, but sometimes just watching, kind of looking at the extreme. of what other people are doing can kind of help you dial in something that's useful.
Mm, nice, nice. Well, we are coming up on time, so this has been fascinating. It's growing my capabilities, helping me reduce my whip, and helping me with Gemba Walks. So I really appreciate it. I feel this has been really helpful for me personally. But before we close down the episode, is there anything you'd like to share or plug?
I don't have anything to plug myself, but like for a friend of mine, I belong to an organization called 7CTO. So if there's people out there on, in an engineering leadership position, like it's something that I've found helpful, and so maybe it's more of a referral than a plug.
Nice, and that was called Seven CTOs, you said?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's not just for CTOs. They're just seven directors of engineering doesn't have the same pizzazz.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us again today. Really appreciate your time, Phil. Really appreciate you sharing this with us and with our audience. And to our audience, please like and subscribe. Please share this with others who you might want to, introduce learning culture, learning capabilities, introduce Gemba Walk, these kind of things to provide insights to help make the next move in your Kaizen. Yeah, please share this with somebody. Please reach out to us. LinkedIn, X, YouTube. We'd love to see your comments and thoughts asynchronously. And until next time, mob on everyone and have a good one. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.